going to change radically the global economy. And here in the West, sometimes we're not aware of the importance of it. So it's really is historical. Now, this rise of emerging market economy explains also many of the paradoxes and conundrums that we see in the global economy. For example, the fall in the real wages of unskilled workers in advanced economies. If you add, 2 billion Indians, and they're all low-skilled, and that implies, from a trade point of view, of course, a fall in the relative return to unskilled labor and return higher to capital. We also have other problems, however. We have greater income inequality in advanced economies. We don't know how much of it is driven by trade, how much of it is driven by skill-intensive technological progress, how much of it is driven by winner-take-all effects, but that's a source of tension. We have these rising commodity prices, oil, energy, food, and other ones, coming from the higher growth of China, India, and other emerging markets. We have this phenomenon of a global savings glut, where this increase in savings in emerging markets keeps long-term interest rates low. We have these global current account imbalances, with the US being the consumer first and last resort, and China the producer of first and last resort. We have this paradox of capital not going from advanced economies to emerging markets, but going from emerging markets to advanced economies, with advanced economies having current account deficits and being net debtor rather than creditors. Now, all these things imply the following thing. The rise of this emerging market, I think, in the long term is going to be a positive force in the global economy. Economists think not in terms of zero-sum games, but they think that integration actually is a positive sum game. The fact that China and India are emerging is going to be, in the long run, good for all of us through lower cost of goods and services that's beneficial to everybody. But it's also true that globalization has to be managed to make sure that it's good for all. And there are lots of tension and dislocation that derive from this globalization. So what are the risks that come from this globalization? We have greater trade conflicts and risk of trade protectionism. We have increased income and wealth inequality, especially in advanced economies. We have these trade wars and these currency wars. Look what's happening with the currency mercantilism of countries like China. We have these hot money flows that are flowing in and out of the countries and sometimes lead to financial crisis. That's why many emerging markets are reactive with capital controls, both on inflows and outflows. There's been some degree of backlash against foreign direct investment, against sovereign wealth funds, the phenomenon of not just of trade, but also of financial protectionism. There has been an increased frequency and virulence of financial crises around the world. They used to occur once every 20 years, now they occur every other year. And not only they occur with more virulence, but the international contagion of them is more severe. Not just from large economies like the US to other countries, but even small economies can have global ripple effects. Look what's happened in the spring with Greece having global contagious effects. So even small economy can have, through financial channels, global transmission effects. There's been this rise of state capitalism with sovereign wealth funds, state-owned enterprises, and publicly owned multinational corporations in emerging markets becoming more powerful. With all the question about what they're going to do, whether they're driven by profit motives or political ones. There's been the failure of the Anglo-Saxon model of a pure laissez-faire model, but also a failure of the continental European social welfare model. So what's the right economic model? An Asian economic model? It's not clear there is one. So those are some of the questions that you have to think in mind about the medium-long term. It's not only the rise in absolute terms and the relative fall of the US and the West that is occurring, but in many ways I would argue there is an absolute fall also in the economic performance of advanced economies. Not just that emerging markets are emerging in relative terms, but there has been also an absolute decline. Take Japan, take Eurozone and the European Union, and take the United States. Japan is a country that has low potential growth, has a demographic decline that is severe, is a country that has never done structural reform, had 15 years of a near depression, has a blocked political system that is not doing any reform. They've changed something like 5 prime ministers in the last 4 years. It looks like Italy in the 60s and 70s. This year alone, they had 2 prime ministers, and if Ozawa this week is successful, it's going to be the 3rd prime minister in 12 months. They have not done the structural reform, and they are in secular long-term decline. It's becoming already the 3rd largest rather than the 2nd largest economy in the world. That's a serious problem. There's deflation, there's a strength of yen. Look at what happened during the spring in the Eurozone. They kicked the can down the road with a $1 trillion bailout package, but sovereign spreads are back to the May level. There is low economic growth. We have deflation at risk, loss of competitiveness, risk of a breakup of the Eurozone down the line, risk of sovereign default in some of the countries. I was last week in a conference in Italy, and the Prime Minister of Belgium said that the Europeans are going to react to this financial crisis by becoming even more common policies and doing coordinated policies. The problem is he cannot keep together his own country. Belgium is a country that is literally breaking up politically, might be divided soon in two. So the guy cannot keep together his own country, let alone having united Europe. Those are the problems that are faced in the Eurozone. And let's think about the United States. United States, in the last 30 years, had periods of high economic growth only when there was a financial bubble, where the real estate bubble in the 80s ended up in the S&L crisis and a severe recession in 1991. Then with the tech bubble in the 90s ended up with a financial crisis in the 2001 recession. Then we created the subprime credit bubble of 06, 07, and then it ended up in the worst economic and financial crisis since the Great Depression. Can we grow in a way that's sustainable without going from one financial bubble and one bubble followed from crash and bust? Is not clear. Certainly this model of laissez-faire approach to financial market without any regulation supervision has failed in the United States. We have very large fiscal deficits that are growing, $1 trillion deficit for as far as I can see, large current account deficits. We have both in the US and advanced economies aging of population and unfunded liabilities coming from Social Security and high and rising healthcare costs. How are we going to deal with it? We have poor and crumbling infrastructures. I would say we even have a very low skills of the labor force. Now, at places like this one and places like Google, of course, the human capital is very high and skilled, but think about what's happening on the average American. There's been a recent study by the US Army that tried to figure out which kind of people they can take into the Army, and they decided to exclude people who have the following characteristics. People that are obese, who are drug users, who don't have a high school degree, and who have a criminal record. Why would the Army care about criminal record if you're a fighter? Because it turns out if you have a criminal record, you start stealing right and left. Turns out if you use these 4 criteria to exclude people, and you take young people, 2/3 of the young population in the United States does not qualify for the Army. Okay? So that's the result of a strategic study of the Army. So they don't qualify for the Army, let alone for being employed in any low-skill or high-skill job. This is a serious problem. We don't think about it. We think about high-tech. We think about the high human capital in this room and around the high-tech company. But there is 2/3 of the population young in the United States who doesn't have the skill to be in the Army. That's a serious problem. We have a culture of instant consumption, instant gratification, of not enough savings. We have increased income and wealth inequality. Is it normal that 1% of the households in the United States control 25% of the income? Double from 20 years ago. It's something that is problematic. We have a gridlock and stalemate in US Congress, in politics. Somebody who has been around in Washington for the last 30 years, senior, told me, I've never seen so much, not disunity, but hatred between the two parties. The problem has to be resolved with bipartisanship. There is no bipartisanship. And after November, there's going to be more gridlock, lack of bipartisanship, and division of government. With this decline of the geopolitical power of the United States that the US doesn't seem to be able to accept, we're going to a multipolar world today. And we have now these nationalist, nativist, and isolationist policies in the United States on immigration towards Muslim and the role of religion in society. I would like to summarize making the following final points. The problems that are in the global economy are global, but the policies are still national. To resolve these global problems, we need global coordination, but that is not occurring. We need it on global climate change, conflicts on water and resources, overfishing of fisheries, global trade conflicts, energy and oil security, global current account imbalances, restoring global monetary and financial stability and avoiding crisis, achieving global security and peace. All these things are international problems that require international policy, but the policies are national. Now, there is a theory in geopolitics that says that in every century you need an hegemon that is providing the global public goods. You know, in the 19th century was the UK, in the 20th century was the US. Today people talk about the Asian or the China century. The trouble is that the US is in decline, it has fiscal burden, it has insular policies, and there is not a balance of great power. It's very hard to achieve a coordination of these policies at the global level, because many of these emerging markets, whether it's China or India, are free riding and are not providing these global public goods. China is free riding on currency, on global climate change, on political issues. India on trade. Russia is a declining power, is not cooperating. The problem is that also formal power is in balance at the UN, at the IMF, at the World Bank, at the G7 level, and so far we have not had a shift of effective global economic power or in the institution of global economic power. So the conclusion is the following one. Globalization, emergence of emerging market economies, trade, technological progress can lead to an outcome that is a better one in the long run if it resolves the problem in the short run. If we don't do it, actually we could end up like Japan with a situation of long-term economic stagnation. That doesn't have to happen, but the policies, especially in the advanced economies, have to start to go in a different direction. Thanks.